Hello, I'm Brandon Barnes. I'm a water resources engineer at Bar Engineering. Most of my work is related to stormwater modeling, floodplain mapping, and flood risk mitigation projects. Today, I appreciate the opportunity to share some background related to a flood risk vulnerability evaluation and prioritization of evaluating flood risk mitigation options for flood-prone areas that's been led by the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District in collaboration with the City of Bloomington. The collaboration began with a floodplain vulnerability evaluation. That evaluation identified numerous flood-prone areas, and given a finite amount of resources, this led to the question of where to begin, or to say it a different way, how to go about the process of determining which area should be evaluated first. The district and the city have been working on developing a framework that can be applied throughout the district and city to address that question. Thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit of information about this ongoing collaboration. I'd like to provide a little bit of background about the district, the floodplain vulnerability evaluation that led to this question of where to begin, and then the process for developing the criteria that are considered in the flood risk mitigation prioritization framework that the district and city are developing. And then I'll wrap up with next steps for how the district may apply this framework throughout the district. Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District is located in the southwest metro area. It's approximately 50 square miles, spanning 2 counties and 6 municipalities. The part of the watershed district that we'll focus on here will be the part that's located within Bloomington. That's in the southeast corner of the watershed. The city of Bloomington is about 38 square miles, of which only 3 are located within the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District. Those three square miles drain west towards Purgatory Creek. As many of you know, flood risk, or defining flood risk, has been a moving target over the last couple of decades, particularly related to the changing definition of the 100-year rainfall depth. So prior to the publication of Atlas 14 in the Twin Cities metro area, it was approximately 6 inches in 24 hours. After Atlas 14 was published, that 6 inches increased to about 7.5, and based on current climate projections, the 100-year 24-hour rainfall depth could increase to over 10 inches in 24 hours in the Twin Cities metro area. The Watershed District completed a floodplain vulnerability evaluation to identify creek crossings and structures located adjacent to their creeks and district managed water bodies that were at risk of flooding. And you can see as the numbers on the left reflect Atlas 14 conditions, present or current conditions, and those numbers are anticipated to increase as the rainfall depths increase. The district stormwater model was developed with a level of resolution that the district needed to manage flows into the creeks and lakes within the watershed. In general, the initial storm model had sub-watersheds in this part of the district that were approximately 75 acres, essentially a regional stormwater pond level of detail. The graphic on the right shows the sub-watershed divides and then the resulting 100-year inundation extents. Based on feedback that the district received from cities within the district, was that while this level of resolution may be adequate for managing flows or calculating flows to the creeks and district managed lakes, it doesn't include enough detail to identify flood-prone areas within the city that the city may be concerned about. So the Watershed District partnered with the City of Bloomington to add resolution to their model. The sub-watersheds resolution increased to an average size of approximately 8 acres per sub-watershed. As you can see here, the black lines are the new sub-watersheds, and the blue inundation polygons are the updated 100-year inundation extents. This resulted in more areas being mapped as within the floodplain, and also identified more potentially flood-prone structures. When this area is considered with the rest of the watershed, the number of flood-prone structures increased from less than 100 or around 50 to over 100 or closer to 150. This led to the district to start asking the question, well, where do we begin? How do we make the decision on which area or which structures to start evaluating first? The City of Bloomington was also asking themselves a similar question. What's shown here is the City of Bloomington municipal boundary. The dark black lines are the watershed district boundaries within the city. The blue inundation extents are for the 100-year flood-prone areas within the city. And the areas of yellow are structures that are based on the city GIS data are within the 100-year floodplain. So given the numerous structures that were potentially flood prone, both the city and the watershed district were asking themselves the same question. How do we make the decision on where to start, which area to evaluate first? To inform that decision, the district turned to their technical advisory committee for guidance and input. The district had a good discussion with their TAC members, really ranging from how members defined flood risk within the community to what each community considered a variable or flood risk, and getting to the point of how different TAC members defined or prioritized areas for flood risk mitigation. The result was that there wasn't a clear or universal approach to how to proactively define and prioritize areas to evaluate to reduce flood risk within the communities. However, the TAC members did provide input on criteria that would be important to them in terms of making those decisions. Those criteria were then used by the watershed district and city to develop a framework for prioritizing these areas. The 6 criteria were the number of flood-prone structures, the frequency of flooding, social vulnerability, project efficiency, whether or not a project in a given location could provide multiple benefits, and critical infrastructure. And through the next several slides, I'll show examples of the inputs into the framework, prioritization framework tool, as well as the underlying source data for defining each of these 6 criteria. So the prioritization framework is an Excel-based tool that allows district and city staff the ability to go in and change the number of points assigned to each subcategory, as well as the flexibility to make modifications to how the tool is calculating the scores for each flood-prone area. This is an example of the first criteria, or the number of structures that are flood-prone within a given area. The column in the middle, the scoring points, which is shaded in light brown, indicates the number of points that are assigned to a given area based on the number of structures that are potentially flood-prone. So if there are no flood-prone structures within a sub-watershed or flood-prone area, there are no points assigned. Whereas if there's greater than 10 residential structures within a given sub-watershed, then there's 10 points assigned. District and city staff have the ability to change those point values. They also have the ability to change the thresholds for how those point values are determined. So for example, if 10 points, this district or city staff wanted to change that from 10 residential structures to 20, they could go into the tool and make that change directly. This is, again, the map of the City of Bloomington, which shown here are all of the structures that were identified as being potentially flood prone. Structures are shown as potentially flood prone because this is based on a GIS desktop analysis, and field survey data or field verification of low adjacent grade and low entry elevations has not been completed. Structures were split into 2 categories: residential, which is shown in yellow, and non-residential, consisting of commercial, office, or institutional structures, are shown in green. The second criteria was frequency of flooding. Structures that may be impacted more frequently received more points or higher scores. The frequency of flooding was used as a proxy in the framework for depth of flooding. The assumption was that Structures that flooded more frequently would also have higher depths of flooding during larger flood events. What's shown in the graphic here is the inundation extents for the 2, 10, 50, and 100-year events. The more frequent events are shown in blue, and the less frequent events are shown in red. The third criteria that was used was social vulnerability. To define social vulnerability, we used the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, a data set that they developed called the Social Vulnerability Index. The data set was developed to help public officials and emergency response planners identify and map the parts of the community that will most likely need support before, during, or after a natural disaster, such as a flood event. The data set indicates the relative vulnerability of each census tract to prepare for and respond to natural disasters. The Social Vulnerability Index ranks each tract based on 15 social factors, which are shown on the left. Each of those social factors are rolled up into 4 general themes, and then there's an overall index value that is calculated. The areas, the warmer colors, the reds and oranges, indicate portions or areas in the community that may be less likely to respond or have more difficulty responding or recovering after a flood event, whereas the areas in light green and darker green indicate areas that may have the resources to be able to respond more quickly following a flood event. The warmer colors received higher points or scores, and the cooler colors, the darker greens, received lower scores in the framework. The fourth category was project efficiency. For this framework, project efficiency was defined by the district and the city as whether a project would be supported by multiple stakeholders. It was defined as either a potential for financial support or if it met the goals published in a district or city plan. For goals, we referenced the city and district's surface water management plans. And for potential funding partners, we looked at the proximity to Twin City Regional Park and recreational areas and state and county transportation routes. The framework is flexible so that as funding partners or project partners are identified in the future, district and city staff can go in and update the tool to reflect the additional potential partnerships, and the scoring and the ranking will update accordingly. The next criteria that was looked at was the potential for a project in a given area to provide multiple benefits or benefits to the district or the city, the community, other than simply mitigation of flood risk. Multiple benefits that were considered looked at potential recreational benefits or the ability to provide or improve ecosystem services. For these, we buffered or looked at the proximity to the National Wetland Inventory, ecological corridors, and the Twin Cities Park and recreational areas. And the final and sixth criteria that we used was critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure was defined by the city and the district as areas within the city that are critical for remaining open to continue to provide services to the community during a flood event. Critical infrastructure was split into 4 subcategories that included critical transportation routes. Critical transportation routes were defined as county roads, state interstates, and major city streets. The second subcategory was emergency services. These are locations that community members may need to access to receive services during or following a flood event. These locations included hospitals, police stations, fire stations, and city government buildings. The third subcategory was emergency support services. So we defined these areas as locations that would need to be accessible as secondary locations or locations where community members may gather following a flood event. These locations included schools, grocery stores, churches. And then the last subcategory that was considered was defined as critical city services. These are services that the city provides to its residents, and it's important that they remain open so that the city can continue to, so that these services can continue to function. These locations were defined as sanitary lift stations and roadways to provide city crews access to either maintain those lift stations and other services. For each location that was in a given sub-watershed, point values were assigned so that the more of these locations fell within a sub-watershed or a flood-prone area, the more points were assigned to that particular location. The end result is a tabular summary that lists the sub-watershed or flood area on the left and the total score that area received. The columns on the right are the criteria 1 through 6, so that city and district staff can see the underlying information that went into tabulating or totaling that total score for a given area. Areas with a higher score indicate that based on the point values assigned by district and city staff, that area is a priority for further evaluation of how to mitigate flood risk. Areas with a lower score indicate that those areas may be less of a priority at this point in time based on the point values and criteria defined. The summary table can be linked in GIS to the city subwatershed information and the district subwatershed information so that these areas can be viewed spatially. What's shown here again is the overview of the City of Bloomington. The 100-year inundation extents are shown, but now they're color-coded based on the scores for given the total scores based on the 6 criteria selected. The warmer colors indicate areas where there were higher scores or a higher priority for evaluation, and the cooler colors indicate areas where there is areas that received lower scores. This provides input or direction for city and district staff to make a determination on where to begin studying or look at evaluating flood risk mitigation first. I do want to note that these results are in draft form. Currently, district staff and city staff are reviewing the 6 criteria and point values assigned to each of those criteria. Pending final input from district and city staff, the next steps will be to finalize this documentation and then work on applying it in other parts of the district. So, as I mentioned, that first step is for the watershed district is for further coordination and collaboration with other cities within the district, looking to add detail resolution to the district stormwater model, and then applying this framework through other cities within the district. Following application of the framework, then it's looking for project partners, locations, completing feasibility studies for flood risk mitigation, and field verification of low adjacent grades and low entry elevations for the structures that were identified as potentially flood prone. And finally, wrap up with implementation of flood risk reduction projects within the district and the city. With that, I'd like to thank you for attending, and I'd also like to invite you to leave your comments and ask questions using the chat feature located in the bottom right corner of your screen. Thank you.